when your brain is transformed by the way you chose to think, so that shows that you're not your brain. You are something that can control your brain to some extent and reshape it. You've said this before, you're not supposed to exist because you are a prime example of what a lot of folks on the left, and even a lot of Christians will say, that you can't do other than your greatest desires. You are taking your greatest desires captive. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5 that we take our thoughts captive to obey Christ. Well, I think that also includes our emotions, our attractions, our desires. And I don't know anybody who's done a better job at this, Brady, than you have. You have taken your thoughts, your desires, your attractions captive, and you have said no to them. And you've made a hard choice. And nobody's perfect, but you do this over and over and over, and you start to be transformed by the renewing of your mind that Paul says in Romans 12:2. And Brady, absolutely. I remember having these discussions with you years ago, and you've adopted these. And like I said, you are the best example of this, of anybody that I know personally. I've seen, there's also scientific evidence to it. It's not just what Scripture says. There's science that supports Scripture. I would say that a guy named Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who was a psychologist at UCLA, he finally discovered the science and brought the scientific data that supports what Paul was saying 2,000 years later. And he shows that we are not determined by our brains and by our physical chemical makeup. Those things are heavy influences on us, heavy influences. Sometimes they feel deterministic. But there is something about you that can take your thoughts captive and say, no, I'm not going to think that way today. And when you do that, even once, your brain starts to carve out a new neural pathway. And it's just like going to the gym. If you go to the gym once and do some bicep curls and say, well, that's it, are you going to be transformed by the renewing of your body? No, you won't. But if you make it a habit, even if you're not perfect at it, let's say, okay, I'm going to go to the gym 5 times a week. And let's say, oh man, it's really hard to do. So you only do it 3 times a week. Are you still going to get transformed? Yeah, maybe slower than you would if you went 5 days a week. But we're not saying you have to be perfect. Start taking thoughts captive. Start taking emotions captive. Start taking attractions captive to obey Christ, the law of Christ, everything that he has said, everything that he has taught, everything that Jesus has exemplified, everything that his apostles who he handpicked to continue his teachings taught. Take your thoughts captive and your desires captive to obey Christ. And over time, these neural pathways in your brain will begin to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And these other ways that you were thinking when you were kind of on autopilot begin to go away. And pretty soon, when your brain is transformed by the way you chose to think, so that shows that you're not your brain. You are something that can control your brain to some extent and reshape it and reprogram it, as it were. And eventually, once you're changed enough, your autopilot starts to, your nature, as it were, almost starts to follow Christ on its own. But you've got to make the hard choices, and that requires libertarian free will. You can make a choice to do other than your brain is telling you, at least some of the time, and that you will be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, I've got a whole argument behind this called the FreeThinking argument, but I just want to start by saying, hey, look, Scripture teaches this, and science backs it up.